Welcome to the Optimalist podcast, where we examine just what it takes to ensure humans flourish in the age of AI. I'm Sarah, your host through this exploration of mindfulness, attention, focus, happiness, and motivation, all elements of human flourishing. So how do we cultivate them? This week, I welcome Jonathon Medeiros to the show. Jonathon has been teaching and learning about language arts and rhetoric for 17 years with students on Kauaʻi, where he was born and raised on a farm. He and his students learn about curiosity, community, and place. They build deeper connections to each other and the places they live by being curious about where they live, the stories of those places, and then following those curiosities. Jonathon is the former director of the Kauaʻi Teacher Fellowship, a poet, essayist, and writes frequently about education, equity, and the power of curiosity. He believes that curiosity kills boredom, and that if you change all of your mistakes or regrets, you'd erase yourself. He walks, paddles, surfs, and builds, and enjoys spending time with his wife and daughters. Listen as John and I discuss curiosity, of course, boredom, intentionality, and the idea of reciprocal responsibility. All this and more in my conversation with John. Have a listen. So, John, how are you?
I am well. I'm very well. I'm sitting here just excited to talk story.
Cool. Well, I wanted to ask you, being that we're kind of just getting connected ourselves, we've been like quote unquote connected for a little while, but we're getting acquainted. We've never spoken to each other before today, ladies and gentlemen, everybody listening. But I think it's been a long time coming that John and I are jumping into a fun conversation like this. So I'm wondering if you can tell us in any amount of detail that you'd like, what has influenced your path right up until what you're doing today, the seat that you're sitting in right now? What has influenced you?
That's like so many things. The first thing I always think of is my wife, my partner. I had no plans to be a teacher. And I met this awesome person when I was working in an intellectual property law firm as a law research assistant for these people who were geeking out about property that exists in your brain. Anyway, she was like, "Hey, we spent a year walking around the city." That's the way we got to know each other. Literally every day we will just walk. And she had always planned on becoming a teacher and said, "Hey, I'm moving away to go back to grad school." And there was like an ellipses at the end of her sentence that was kind of like, "So if you want to keep hanging out with me, I'm leaving." Love it. So I basically I followed her to school, and I love learning. I'm naturally a curious person. I don't know if I'm naturally a curious person. I think I was taught to be curious by my father. So I've always loved learning, and I was like, cool, I'll go learn about that. And plus I get to hang out with Aaron more. So those were like the first steps to, that was like 18 or 20 years ago.
Oh, wow.
So I hope that's a long story. I don't know how many steps I should walk us through until I got to this chair.
We can. I love a guest that takes my words exactly the way they come out of my mouth. Well, why don't we zip forward a little bit and think about, and I know some things about your work from what I have followed online and what you've told me, but everything that I do know seems to be wrapped up into these, kind of wrapped up and related to each other. Like you do a lot of things that are intentionally connected, or you're drawn to a lot of work and projects and viewpoints that are connected. And you're also a writer. And so maybe you want to just give us a little bit of insight into what makes up your world right now, what influences what the choices that you make in what you work on and how you do it.
So no problem. So I really have, over the 17 years that I've been in the classroom, kind of kept sharpening and focusing in my work to where I am now, and to this like hyper simplistic viewpoint on learning. And basically right now, I really want my students to practice curiosity about where they happen to be, and about the people that they happen to be with. So like that's the foundation of my class, but it's also the foundation of how I think I should live and how my family and my daughters should live. We should be curious about this place that we happen to live in, and we should interrogate the privilege that allows us to be here and uncover the stories that are buried in this place and hidden underneath the various layers of, settler colonialism and the different names that have erased the different stories. Anyway, so that idea is really foundational to this class. So in my class with my students, we practice that curiosity, and we literally ask those kinds of questions like, where are we? What's the name of this place? What does that name mean? Who named it that? And we kind of surround that investigation or that curiosity with various voices and various texts, and we listen to the conversations that other people are having through their writing. When people have conversations across time about various topics, and I try to connect my students to those conversations. So we first eavesdrop on them, and then we end by their participating in the conversations as well.
There are so many things that you're saying. I'm like feverishly writing down like one word phrases because I can't possibly take notes fast enough for things that I already came in with things I wanted to ask. And then I'm like, oh, wait, I want to jump to that instead as you're talking. So, but I, first of all, love that you open with the center of everything being just this one word of curiosity. And I think that it's if we start with that one word, that one idea, the curiosity that you speak of is not just of, or at least I think it becomes, right, not just of everything that's around us, but also what is within us, and then the other human beings that are around us. Not just looking back at ancestors, but people that we intentionally choose to be around. And I think that there's an interconnectedness that you are cultivating through this path of curiosity. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. I feel like when we do that kind of curious, or when we act curious in that way, we either see the connections that are there, or we start to strengthen connections that maybe were there, right? Or we develop those connections even more. And then that builds empathy, and that builds a sense of responsibility to each other, hopefully.
And so I'm going to quote you.
Okay.
I'm going to quote you from, everybody listening will have already heard this when you hear this full episode, but you made a statement in your biography that you so wonderfully wrote out for me, that one of your beliefs is that curiosity kills boredom or destroys boredom. And then I kind of was typing some notes earlier, and I wrote a little question to myself next to it to ask you, like, can anything kill curiosity? However, then I remembered part of it, it sparked something in my brain that it was like a Dorothy Parker quote. And then I went and found the full quote. And so Dorothy Parker's full quote was, "The cure for boredom is curiosity, but there's no cure for curiosity." And I just wanted to kind of open you up to maybe exploring a little bit about what it is, this idea of boredom and what causes people to jump into or spring forward into not just accepting mediocrity or what's there or what's given to you, and being inspired, I guess, to go to move forward into a curious mindset. And that's really where everything starts. And how do we do that?
I love the idea of curiosity as uncurable. Once you are infected with it, it's there. But I do think there's an intentionality to boredom. And like I've been kind of obsessed with this. Another quote, which is less positive, that's on my board. It's forever. It comes from a Harvey Danger song, actually. If you're bored, then you're boring, is another way of framing that. And that's on my board. And it eventually sinks into students, and they realize, like, oh, there's a choice here. I'm bored, but I'm choosing to not interact with the thing that we're doing, or to not interact with the human that's next to me. So that's where I start from. That boredom is a choice. We're never going to, I shouldn't say never. We're often in situations where we didn't choose to be there, or we didn't choose to do this activity, but I'm not going to let that moment like be stolen from me or wasted, I'm going to choose to be curious about it because I don't want to waste a minute or an hour of my life or let somebody else steal it from me, right?
Right.
So we talk about that in class. I talk about that choice. Like the first step is like you have to pretend that you care about this thing. And then eventually, like the quote you read, I think eventually you actually do care. The curiosity kind of starts to burn and then you want to know something else.
Yeah. And so I'm going to interject 1 second because you're kind of echoing a lot of core beliefs on the Focusable team that we have, and a lot of our optimalist community by extension. This idea that interest doesn't always have to precede curiosity. And that, right. We don't have to only follow things that we innately feel drawn to because we're going to find these, in fact, you might even agree that boredom is super useful. Like we need it.
Right.
Right. Not just curiosity, but for creativity by extension.
Yeah.
Right. We need times where our mind is idle.
Right.
Otherwise it's not searching and looking for something more beyond the ordinary.
Well, I think sometimes that's what happens with people is there's a discomfort in that moment, like letting yourself just be and then having to sit with your own brain. For some people it feels uncomfortable. And so we numb that with, meaning whatever, going on to scrolling through TikTok or something. Because I can't stand to just be analog and to just sit. Like
the universal we all, yes. Yeah.
Humans.
Yeah.
So I think it's sometimes we have to be okay with that, like discomfort, right? I'm going to be by myself for a second. I know I don't need to numb my brain with this thing. And hopefully that boredom, it does like let your brain wander and then lead to something else. I don't know.
Yeah. And it's like, this is what you're describing there is where things like the great myth of multitasking come about. I mean, even if we think of our leisure time, people will now watch a film, even like with their family, but everyone's on their phone too.
Everyone's on their phone.
Or by yourself. You'll put TV on yourself and it becomes like if someone were to peek into your house at that moment, they would see you looking like you're relaxing in the evening after a day of working, but you have a TV on and a phone in your hand and your laptop open next to you. But then you could switch contexts and, I could be out walking my two dogs in the woods and you can bet I either have a podcast on or I'm catching up on like 5 texts from earlier. So even that is this idea of I'm not letting myself be in that present moment. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I need to fill that with something. And there's, there's something there. There's something useful about that too, though, right? Like I'm going to go on a walk and listen to this podcast because I'm curious about this thing and I want to keep learning. But yes, it can become too much, I think, or we can become too reliant on those kinds of crutches. That's why I love being in the ocean because I can't take anything out there.
Yes, that is true. That's a great idea. And yeah, there was like maybe it was like a year and a half ago or so. I used to be someone that if you ask me, how many different podcasts do you listen to, like different shows? Like, I mean, I was listening to like 10 shows a week. And I know all the dates that things come out. And then at one point, my brain just got overloaded because what happens is if you are listening to that much, that's not the only thing I'm listening to. Yeah. But I'm filling every moment. I'm folding laundry. I'm listening to something.
Yeah.
I'm doing, and I love like doing certain tasks and listening to stuff. But when there's never silence and never any time for anything else, like I'm not creating anything. And so even cutting that in half allows me, I get to the point where I'm like, I call myself a writer. I'm not writing anything. I'm just consuming. Constantly. Right. And I might be curious about something I'm listening to, but in my mind, unless that curiosity is leading me to take action, where is it? It's remaining idle.
And you're exactly right. And I think that's a really big part of the way I try to process the world and what I try to convince my students to do as well. So maybe we're curious and we seek that input and we consume things to feed that curiosity, but then at some point we need to stop and then just process all of that, right? And with no other, for me at least, no real agenda except to process it. So I'll just sit down and write with no real end in mind, because that's one way that I figure out, what do I think about any of this stuff that I just, otherwise it just disappears into the ether of my mind if I don't have that moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for me, reflective writing is a really important part of this, learning this thing I was talking about curiosity earlier. So in my class, that's a regular part of what we do. We have to stop and just write, because it's part of thinking. Otherwise, we're just like you said, I'm not creating anything. I'm not going anywhere.
Right. And it's in making connections between all that stuff, I think is super important. And then I know that a part of all of this is we've mentioned a little bit being intentional, and I'm assuming that also goes hand in hand with mindfulness. Are there ways that you, other than what we've talked about so far, that you incorporate elements of mindfulness into your class, into your teaching, even into your home life, like anything that you want to share about how you make being mindful something that is, I think, super important to our mental health and sense of self?
Well, when we first, this is now a couple of years in our rearview mirror, but when we first went into lockdown at the beginning of the pandemic, which I remember exactly was March 13th, 2020, my family and I, on Kauaʻi, it was a really big deal. The whole island was shut down.
Yeah.
Nobody was coming and going, and we were really not supposed to leave our houses for a long time. So as a family, we took up a mindfulness practice, or something we had already been doing, but kind of like exaggerated it. And at the end of every day, we would all sit together and have one thing to focus on. And it would change every day. Maybe it was like your favorite image from today, a moment that happened to you, or 5 minutes ago, whatever, the name of the street that you live on. It was different every time. Sometimes there was no real prompt. It was just today. And we'd have 5 to 10 minutes of just silence. And the four of us would sit there and write in our own way. My daughters at the time were 7 and 10, or 8 and 11. And we'd all write, and then we'd read to each other. And we literally did that every day for 6 months. And then it kind of slowed down, and we would do it a couple times a week. So that was an amazing, just deciding. We talked about intentionality. You pick something. Every day we're going to do X, and then you do it. It doesn't have to be very long, right? Just a few minutes. And now we do some at the end of every day. We just before we sit down and eat dinner, we all just say what we're grateful for, which I know is a very common, it sounds trite to some people, but it's another version of that. Like, let's just pause and be mindful of something from this day that made me feel grateful. So that's what we're doing right now.
Yeah. And that the gratefulness practice, and for people who haven't tried it takes on an incredibly different meaning when you do it daily, right? Rather than a few times a year, or at certain times of the week. When you do it daily, it's like, think of the hundreds of things that you have to pick.
Right. Yes, exactly.
Hundreds of things, and they become commonplace things like the sun. Like, to me, like, and those become the most transformational, right? When it really brings you to the exact place and moment in time that you are every day.
Right.
And it's super grounding, and also super good for, I think, building. It helps with like a habit of attention. Really, you're paying attention.
That exactly right. It helps you pay attention. And I just love that phrase, by the way. I talk to my students about that often, that you have to pay it. It costs you something, which is why it feels good when somebody pays attention to you, because they're spending some of their attention on you.
Which is why also that we feel so depleted when our attention is stolen, when it's taken from us.
Yes.
It's super costly. And I mean, it's the whole purpose of all of this work that I'm doing, that we're doing with Focusable, is getting people to be more mindful of the time that they spend, and how we're spending all of those minutes in one full day. Like, what are your routines or habits of attention?
And we spend so many of them without even thinking about it. This goes back to that intentionality. When you look back, you realize, oh, damn, what did I spend all that on?
I love that you keep repeating the spending your attention, because I've been trying even more so to replace the word time with attention. Like I wasn't wasting time. Like if I just say, oh, an hour just went by, what was I doing? I wasn't really wasting the time. The time doesn't really exist. It's my attention that exists.
Yeah.
Where was my, time is nothing. It's, attention exists in me. Where were my eyeballs for those last 20 minutes, 50 minutes? And that's where you really start to cultivate that self-awareness, right? It's not time's fault.
Right.
Anybody else's fault.
Right.
But yeah, that I think gives us a personal responsibility to it. And that itself is curiosity.
Right. Yes, exactly.
So I did want to just bring it back a little bit to going back up to the connection between all of these things. So I'm just going to list out a few of these elements that we've been chatting about and that I know that you have a deep interest in. So we're talking about mindfulness just now, how the practice of reflective writing, that your connection to place, I think you were opening with at the beginning. Curiosity, of course, is bringing us to the center of this. And then a couple of things that I wanted to work towards the ending of our conversation on were the value of connection between the self and others, and then connection to all these other things, of course. And then also the value of the process, right? And I might be saying two things that are completely not opposite, but different and, not really connected in your mind. But I know that these two things bring a lot together of what it is that you're thinking about in your work. So maybe you could enlighten us a little bit about how important connection is in your classroom, and then also in life, and the idea of focusing on the process, because I think that also has to do a lot with where we spend our attention.
Yeah. Okay, I can do that. I'll start with connection, and that is a big deal. In Hawaii, the word for connection is pilina, connectedness, and there's also an idea of a reciprocal responsibility to each other and to the places we live. So we're responsible for our places, and the places are responsible for us too. It goes back and forth. That's called kuleana. And I think what happens is students don't realize the connections are there, or their connections have frayed. They are not connected to their places because they don't know their places. So that as I said earlier, that's kind of where that's kind of foundational to the class. We investigate where we are and who we're with so that we can figure out how we're connected. And then the next question is, what is my responsibility here to keep this connection healthy and strong? So I think by learning about each other, they start to realize like, oh, we're kind of like, we have this in common. We don't have that in common. Maybe I can talk to you more. And my students echo this all the time. They just were talking about it yesterday. At the beginning of the school year, one thing I do to help with this kind of connectedness with each other is I randomly just put the kids into groups of 5 at the very first day of school. And I tell them, you didn't choose these groups. You wouldn't have chosen them. Your job is to figure out how to work together. And they often don't like it. It's difficult. But by the end of the year, they're repeatedly telling me that those are now some of their most interesting friends. We've realized that we all disagree or see things differently, but it makes for such vibrant and interesting conversations when we're talking about XYZ. So throughout the year, they've built a connection with each other, with these different people that on campus, they typically would have just walked past.
Right.
I hope I didn't veer too far afield on that.
No, keep going. No, you're making me think of our just ideas regarding like the loneliness epidemic and how we like to pretend that we're quote unquote connected through
the technology.
Yeah. But when do we practice just that simple act that you just described your students practicing? When do we do that with strangers on the internet?
Right. We don't look at just looking somebody in the eyes and actually listening to them. And that's where the responsibility part comes in. So now you're my group member. I'm working with you. I'm talking with you. I'm building this relationship. Eventually, they recognize that responsibility extends past the classroom. I'm responsible for this connection now. when I see you outside, right? Now I talk to you there too. And those webs just get a tiny bit larger. And then hopefully something similar happens when we do that bigger in curiosity about the places we live. They find connections to their communities, to the beaches, a place that they used to think, this is my favorite beach. After being curious about that place and its entire history for the last 1,000 years till now, they hopefully feel responsible for and connected to that place in a different way. And maybe they take people there now, or maybe they tell people about it, and that's the way that they keep their connection strong and healthy or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah.
But the point is they develop a different relationship with each other and with the places that they learn about.
And the hope is that cycle would continue, that they would pass that.
Right, exactly. And that goes to the other question you were asking me about the process being valuable.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get to any of this? It's really just through work. The valuable stuff is in the day-to-day work when we pay attention to what my partner is telling me.
Uh-huh.
I'm changing in that moment if I pay attention to it and if I value it. A lot of times the school system and life in general has kind of brainwashed people to think it's the end product that's valuable, the grade, the letter grade, the score, which is completely erroneous, right? There's no learning in the letter grade, in the GPA. There's no learning there. And John Darnielle from the Mountain Goats has a colorful way of talking about it. He says that the end product is a carcass.
Yes.
All the work leading up to it is where the learning was.
Well, you've just made my week quoting Mountain Goats on this episode. I forgot that there were a few other tidbits that we had in common.
Yeah.
I love that. And that's perfect. Maybe we'll put a carcass on the cover of this episode. Nice. I don't know if that'll go over well, but we'll see if we can find a nice one.
A nice one,
a pretty one. Well, before we start to kind of move into our ending questions, is there anything from the conversation that we've had so far that you feel like you'd like to add to, or that you want to highlight or stress for people who are looking to kind of get more of these elements into their own classrooms or even into their own home life? Anything that you want people to know about the way you've kind of cultivated this work for yourself?
I'm not sure. I think that it often sounds overly simple when I talk about this stuff, but I do feel like, if you were curious about making a change to your classroom, if you're a teacher, or to your home life, like it really is as simple as deciding on some simple thing to pay attention to and then do that repeatedly.
Mm-hmm.
And, so in my classroom, as I've talked about, we do that repeated reflective writing. We value the change that happens while we sit quietly and write for 5 minutes. And it becomes a really important part of our day. And so even just that, I think, is a good first step.
Right. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah. And I always add to that, like, the patterns of your day matter too, right? Like getting used to when you do certain things. It helps you if you're someone who thinks that you don't spend your attention well. It helps to start by doing things at a certain time of day, I think.
Right. That's exactly right. I'm all about, my wife makes fun of me about this. I'm all about routines. Like, that's same thing, same time. And partially because it makes me feel comfortable. I get it. My anxiety level goes up when I don't know exactly when something's going to happen. And that's a problem. The way I self-medicate is by setting up routines. But in a classroom, I want my students to have as little anxiety as possible, right? I want them to know what they're going to expect every day, so that they can come in here with their guards down and ready to explore. Because it is anxiety. It's risky, right? If you're not good, quote unquote, good at something, it feels risky to try. So I want to make it feel as safe as possible for the kids to take those risks, to try to be honest, because sometimes that doesn't feel great.
Yeah, and especially since they're, when they come into a classroom, they're coming into a group setting as well. So they're not each individually in control of how everything goes in their own way. So I think that those kinds of boundaries are important to start while people are learning. So, okay, I'm just really excited about how organically we talked about attention and used the phrase "pay attention." I'm so happy that you brought that up. So that's wonderful, and we're going to bring up attention one more time before we end here. But right before we get to that, let's talk a little bit more about what it is that goes in and out of your brain on a regular basis. And can you give us an idea as to what kinds of things you're reading, watching, listening to right now, or that are some of your favorite things? What influences your world?
I am always, when I see that, what are you listening to? Only later did I realize, I wonder if that was supposed to be about like podcasts.
Oh, it could be anything. I should have written that there. Yeah.
It's okay. I always think of music. I always listen to music. There's music in my head kind of constantly. And so I'm a voracious, I don't want to say consumer, but I want music all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So every morning talking about routines. Every single morning I wake up at 5, make a cup of coffee, and I read Pitchfork magazine.
Nice.
And I just tried, what are the new reviews? Who's out there? And I just start playing snippets of music, and that's cool. And I add it to my playlist, and it kind of disappears into the 16 or 20,000 songs on my,
I'm sure,
on my thing. But over time, some of those bubble up, and I realize, I've been listening to that song for 5 years, and only now in this moment is it connecting on a conscious level.
Mm-hmm.
So recently, this song called Birding made its way back into my brain by a group called Sweatshop Boys, SWBT.
Nice.
Anyway, I'm not trying to, it's an entire song listing bird names, and it blew my mind. I'm just obsessed with it at this moment. But there's music all the time in my head.
Cool.
And I just finished an amazing book called Also a Poet. I read a ton of nonfiction because of what I've been teaching. I have a master's in literature, and that used to be my life. But I've almost read exclusively nonfiction now, and poetry, which I consider a primary source.
Yep.
But I read this book called Also a Poet by Ada Calhoun. I think you would love it, Sarah. I don't know if you've read that book.
I have not. I'm writing it down.
It's kind of technically a memoir, but it's really about her figuring out her father by going to a project that he left unfinished about the poet Frank O'Hara. So the book is fascinating. It's just it's a beautiful text, and it's it's like kind of, for me, the kind of perfect nexus between poetry and nonfiction.
I love that. So it's technically kind of like a memoir.
I mean, it's awesome. I think she calls it a bio. Like it's weird. It's like a biography of her father, a biography of Frank O'Hara, but it's a memoir of her life. It's also a poetry review. It's kind of everything.
It sounds like we're at the Academy Awards and they're playing us off.
Did you hear that? Yeah, I know.
They're like, it's time to go, guys. That's okay. Cool. And anything that you're watching, you might not be a watcher of stuff. Are you a watcher?
My family and my daughter, just like me, she's obsessed with routines. So every night we have to watch a show as a family. That's in her head, no matter what time it is.
It's the same.
And,
yeah.
Right. So we run out of shows often, and my wife and I don't always want to watch what she wants to watch. We recently just binged the show Acapulco. Have you heard of this show?
I have not.
We all loved it. It's amazing. There's only 2 seasons, sadly. That's what we just, literally last week, and we're sad because we're waiting for season 3 to drop. Acapulco. It's beautiful. It's like a great combination of kind of like sweet and drama and comedy. It also has a little tinge of Mexican soap opera to it. It's great. Yeah.
I love it. And this is one of the reasons I love asking these kinds of questions at the end, is because I think we do get a sense of something that you've spoken about throughout this entire conversation is also reflective in the things that you listen to and watch and so on. And I think the curiosity element and connectedness is definitely a through line through everything that you think about and look at, I think. And so with that, we're going to end with our question. What is a method for focusing or improving your attention that you find actually works?
For me, I like, as I think I alluded to earlier, I like to go somewhere where I can't accidentally spend my attention on other things. So like being in the water forces me to be completely present and in just that. And all I can do is pay attention to the feeling of the water and the rise and fall of the swell and the feel of the wind and what the shore looks like. And I know we all can't do that, but if there's a way to slice away those other things that might steal our attention, that's what works for me, to force myself into that. And it's not much of a force because I love being in the water anyway.
Right. Yeah. And when you mentioned it earlier, I was thinking briefly, like, are there other environments that we can really do that? I think most other things we can kind of slip. We can slip something into our pocket.
I know, right. I know.
If we really wanted to. But I mean, I at least just try to make a habit of, I do tons of walks because I have two like hunting dogs. So I'm always in the woods, but I try to do my morning and night walk without a phone. So I'm not listening to anything. So like, and that became a habit. So I've been doing that for years because it's a routine of like, and if one day I had to do it last week, one day last week, I had my phone with me on my morning walk and it felt so crazy. I was like, this is wrong.
This is weird. What's going on?
It is morning. The sun is barely up. I'm supposed to be breathing the air. Why is my phone in why am I listening to this podcast? Anyway, but yeah, that's the power of all of those things that we build for ourselves, that once we know and feel that they're healthy and helping us cultivate good attention and healthy attention, when we lose them or go off the path, it feels, you can feel it. And that's what I want more and more people to feel that power that we all have within us, really. Yeah,
you do have the power, and I think that's key. You can just kind of make that choice. I'm going to, even just for a minute, I'm going to spend the first minute of this day. Hopefully it's more than a minute, but
1 minute, 2 minutes, and build it up. Yeah. That's all you have to do. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so glad that we got to have our first conversation live in front of 1,000 people. Not really live, but recorded for people to listen to later. And the last thing I'm going to ask you is if people would like to follow you or check out what you do or work on or say hi, would you like to share any of your social media? Do you have a website that they can check out?
Sure, of course. Yeah, I am on Twitter at John Medeiros, and my website is jonathonmedeiros.com, which is THON. It might be spelled somewhere. And I don't update it. I keep my essays and poetry up there, and some of my mindfulness writing is there too. I spent a year just writing about every time I touched the water, I wrote, and that's up there too. So yeah,
that's really beautiful. That is a real practice of attention right there.
It was a fun project.
Yeah. Okay. And all of those links will be available for everybody to access in the show notes, and as well as anything else that we talked about here today. I think that's it.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks for listening this week. And thanks to John for taking the time to share a piece of his teaching journey and experience with us. John is a great example of someone who is taking it upon himself to build a community of mindful students. Of course, I'm eager for your feedback and reactions as well. It's the best way to help the podcast grow in its purpose and to help us keep getting better at what we do. You can leave a comment on Substack, a review in Apple Podcasts, and you can reach me on Twitter at scandela9. You can listen and subscribe to the Optimalist podcast wherever you love listening to great podcasts. New episodes are released every Wednesday, and links to all of these resources are available in the show notes. The Optimalist podcast is brought to you by Focusable, the only app that gives you the pulse you need for better attention. And it's free. Create an account today at getfocusable.com or by downloading Focusable on any iOS or Android device. You can also follow us at GetFocusable on Twitter and Instagram. Thanks for listening to the Optimalist podcast. I'll see you next week. Stay focused.